A society prospers when old people plant trees, knowing that they won't be around to sit in their shade.
Welcome to a very special episode of Tea with Tea. Today I'm joined with Elliott. We're going to talk about lots of good things. But Elliott, why don't you just introduce yourself, tell us where you're based, where you're calling in from, what you do, and what you're passionate about.
Hi T, thanks for having me on. I'm calling in from Brisbane, so it's very nice, warm, sunny weather at the moment. I work for a retail bank in Australia. I've been doing process improvement, target operating model design for the last 6 years. Before that, I was working in heavy asset industries such as electricity transmission, water treatment. All have been within process improvement and organizational design. What am I passionate about? I'm passionate about process. That's been literally my whole life. And more recently, I'm also interested in property as well. So property investment, property architecture, construction, angel investing, so the startup space as well. So technology that's emerging and really disrupting the way that we think. People listening to this again will probably see that as a bit of a dichotomy to what we're going to talk about, where there's like this disruption over long-term mindset, but yeah, that'll be something to get into.
Perfect. And yes, all puns intended. I've been waiting a long time for this talk. So today's topic is the long-term mindset. So let's just get into it. How long is long-term, or in other words, how do you define for yourself what is long-term mindset?
I think it's going to be different for different people, but personally, I like to think in 3 generations. So what are my children's perceptions going to be, their actions and my actions on them, and then their children's perceptions and sort of reactions to what is being performed now.
That's a nice thing with that. Just jumping into, because today is also Black Friday, so happy Thanksgiving for everyone in the States. But if you look at the Black Friday sale and then say 40% off, that's actually an arbitrary number, right? It could also be 39% or 41%. So it seems a little bit emotional. We're fixing it with a 5, with a 0 at the end. So when you talk about then the duration of long-term mindset, you actually said generations. So if your kids would have families early, then that could be very short. And if somebody actually has kids later, so there's no number attached to it.
Yeah, it's probably less about number and more about order impacts, as in first order impacts will be impacts on my children's generation. Second order impacts will be effects on my grandchildren's generation. Now, this is probably for people without kids. It's not about your family line going forward. It's more about your impact on human society over the next generation after. So it's more, it's not so fixed in terms of time scale, but more about this concept of first and second order impacts.
But if we look at this, and it doesn't matter whether it be 20 years, 50 years, or even 10, nowadays with so many different complex things happening in the world, it is so hard to actually predict anything. Not only about COVID, brittle supply chains, and we're still dealing with a lot of, let's say, anxiety, also in terms of geopolitics. Let's take a very, very small recent topic, and probably it's still in the making. Why should it matter to have this long-term mindset if prediction is so hard to near impossible? Even thinking about corporate succession planning, aka OpenAI and Microsoft, and what's going on there.
Yeah, I think it's more probably around prioritizing your time, decision making, with the impact on what that's going to have long term. So thinking about what's important for you, it might be family, friends, it might be your savings. So income minus your expenses. How do you retain purchasing power of your savings? It might be the impact of your life or your work. It might be your work more generally. And then how these facets over time, and how do you decide and prioritize based on that? There's a thing about fortune favors the patient in time. And so I think it's like, in terms of prediction and thinking about how do we actually predict and what's actually the value of prediction, a lot of the predictions that you actually see is what's going to be different over time. So you'll see, oh, we'll all be, the prediction will all be flying cars in 20 years' time. We'll have the brain-human interface with the computer, so we can no longer have to type. We can just think of things, and the user interface is effectively directly connected to our thoughts. So this is all prediction, which is based on what is different to now, which is exciting, it's entertaining, it's interesting. But is it useful? I don't think it's that useful. What I think is actually more useful personally, and when you're thinking about strategic planning as an organization, is actually the question of, in the future, what's going to be the same? And so that's actually what you can start planning around, is what do I know is going to be the same as it is now, and I can plan for that 10, 20, 30, 50, 100 years into the future. So that's effectively what I think is useful in predicting for the future.
That's a good one. I think right on top of my head, I think I don't know how a sales department or a procurement department will look like, but I think we still are talking in terms of activities like a purchase to pay or order to cash. And I probably think that we have customers who are humans and not machines. So it's very, very interesting. Let me actually bring in then another parameter here. And how do you go about, let's say you have a long-term mindset, where you get the energy from. For now, I just park it. But how is then your decision-making affected in terms of knowing, let's take property. By the way, in German, property is a Immobilie, meaning it does not move. Yeah, that's a literal translation. How do you make then decisions based on that long-term mindset on whether it's property A or B? What factors would then come in if we take that specific example?
Property is probably a little bit nuanced. And I think we've talked about this in the past, which was property in itself isn't the physical property. It's actually a place where people live and do life. And so it's actually, when you're talking about property A or property B, it's actually thinking about the psychology of a human and what do they actually use the different spaces for. So if you're in the Northern Hemisphere and you're further north away from the equator, you're probably looking for a house or an apartment it faces south. If you're in the Southern Hemisphere and you're further away from the equator, you're looking for an apartment or a house that faces north. And the reason is you want the breezes, you want the natural light that's coming in and those sort of things. So there's a whole heap of attributes that are similar to that in property, where you've got flow through the building, you've got different directions, and it's really about the nature of human psychology, which is actually why I'm interested in property. It's about understanding what people's life is, what their perceptions are, how they're going to use a space, and really trying to get into the psychology of a person. And that's why I think property investing is interesting, because those are values that don't change. One of the things that don't change over time. They will be the same. They have been the same in the past and will be, I believe, the same in the future.
Very interesting. Then really doing a hard, sharp turn, and then in organizational design and in companies, I mean, that has changed quite a lot. Still humans though. So how do you go about that? I mean, just to share, to lift off this topic, I think probably 20 years ago, we had a lot of scenario planning, but we also noticed, with all the scenarios you're planning, with all the different assumptions you're doing, sometimes you reach a level of complexity, we literally lose motivation to actually address all the hypothetical what ifs. So how can you, maybe the question is more around, like, can you share some decision making frameworks or models on how to actually operationalize this kind of mindset, for example, in the organization?
Yeah, so when you're talking about long-term mindset, there's probably a good rule of thumb, which is called the Lindy effect. I think this was developed initially in the early 1900s, maybe the mid 1900s, in New York, has a very obscure history. It's actually pretty interesting to look up. So Lindy effect, you can have a look on later. But effectively, it was popularized by an author who was a statistician in the finance sector called Nassim Taleb. He's also worth reading all of his books. But effectively, it's the concept where the Lindy effect effectively says if something has been around for a certain amount of time, it's likely to exist in the future for that same amount of time. Now, this only applies to non-perishable concepts. So, for example, the milk in your fridge or the meat in your fridge, it has actually a natural perishable date. Humans are perishable. They have sort of like an 80-year time span. So they are effectively perishable. But there's things that exist that are physical that don't, like rocks, for example, are non-perishable. What else? Ideas are non-perishable. DNA, as in not the DNA itself, but the information carried in DNA is non-perishable. So they're the things that can be applied to, well, the Lindy effect can be applied to. Now, as you can see, this is actually a type of extrapolation. And the things that's an issue with extrapolation is, you have spurious correlations that this correlates to this over a long period of time. And if you extrapolate that over, you can make significant errors. And you're talking about Thanksgiving. If you think about the turkey, right? The turkey is born and then it grows and it increases in weight over time. And it looks like it will increase in weight for infinity. Like it's literally a very strong curve going up, right? But then Thanksgiving happens and then the weight disappears. And the reason is, well, it's been eaten around a table. And so effectively, you don't want that type of sort of poor extrapolation to happen. So it should be probably taken as a rule of thumb as opposed to a really strong, decision-making framework, but a really nice rule of thumb.
That's really, thanks for sharing this insight. I haven't thought about it because this is one of our challenges, isn't it? Like to really tie, or first of all, understand correlation, but also somehow tie it to any causality, if there is any. And I think the extrapolation makes, as you said, it's very error prone. But yeah, I guess as long as we don't have time machines, we will always have to deal with this topic. But let's dwell a little bit in, like when you have, let's say, a long-term plan, and often we also talk about people who succeed because they have a grit, to keep on long-term visions. How do we nuance then, like what does it mean to be, let's say, flexible and agile? What is giving up, or what is carving in, versus, oh no, this person has grit, never gives up, But I mean, making a mistake all the time doesn't also help either, right?
Yeah. I think it goes probably back to the conversation about predictions about the future, what is interesting versus what is useful. And so if you think about what's useful in a business, it's really about what are the core values that will retain over a long period of time? What are my core strategies that need to retain and be consistent over time versus what can be variable? Now, these will obviously change over time because there are events that happen in the world that you have no ability to foresee. Black swans actually happen. And so maybe it's a slight digression. But if you think of the concept of iatrogenics, which is another thing that Nassim Taleb talks about, which is a doctor performs a particular procedure and unintentionally harms the patient because of some second order effect, like might be a bacterial infection as a part of a surgery or something like that. Now, if that wasn't necessary surgery, they've put the patient in harm for no particular benefit. And it's because of the action versus inaction. So probably the argument for long-term thinking is really trying to understand what should be focused on being consistent and where you should actually drive towards action. And it really is action, and performing any sort of action can cause harm. So should inaction be your first reaction? And so I think to take this maybe one step further is the trolley problem, where you've got the line of the train line going one way or the other. And there's a study actually happening at the moment in MIT called Moral Machines, and they take this trolley problem because the autonomous car, while humans can't think of in the split second to make the decision between two paths, the autonomous car can. And so there might be a situation where there's two people in a car heading towards an intersection with two people crossing it. The brakes fail. And so now there's actually a decision that the autonomous vehicle needs to make. Do we make no action and hit into the people? Or do we make an action and move the car into a wall and potentially harm the people in the car? Now, inaction potentially might be it's out to the jury, right? But it might be the better action in this regard, because anytime you act, it's actually susceptible to a black swan. So, for example, you might swerve the car or try to swerve the car, but you hit some oil or something else that's like black swan you can't actually think of. And it actually creates a situation where everyone in that situation is harmed. Whereas in action, potentially just going through the intersection may be the better outcome. It's actually very difficult to see where inaction and action is actually going to be the better outcome. But that's effectively what long-term thinking is trying to achieve in terms of where should we be acting and where should we be inacting and retaining consistency.
I think it's actually we just delved into philosophy. No, actually not at all. I think we delved a little bit into philosophy in terms of, you know, whether you're more on the, I don't know, on the Kant side with the categorical imperative, or, you know, like the topic of, you know, means justify the ends, or the action itself has a value, or it's the consequences which we have to value. Yeah. I think it's a very interesting thing, because at least what is a problem is also defined by us ourselves, right? So instead of saying, you know, now you made the wrong decision, quotes unquote, wrong is in the eye of a human beholder, right? That's why we have correct and right, two different things, right?
Yeah.
And I always just simplify to say that right is the human version of correct, and it depends. So maybe the decision in that one moment might have been correct, but not right to our standards of what we maybe value kids more than old people, or vice versa, depending on what kind of generation we live. So yes, very interesting. I'm sorry, I have to go back, and because I'm a little bit fixated on now that you talked a little bit about property and the human psychology. Let's go back to Roman times.
Yeah.
If I built a house which could last for 1,000 years, or I want to build now a second villa, casa, palazzo, whatever, is it not actually extremely inefficient to do that? Is it a waste of resources? Because I'm actually saying, hey, I don't know what is the future, and probably in Roman times I couldn't think of flying cars or 200-meter high buildings and stuff like that. But people need to live. People need to have a bedroom. Let's say I assume that would be remaining the same. Is it then good to build for this long-lasting future, to have this kind of planning? Or am I actually looking backwards, overcharging the construction cost? Because most of it would probably tear down, because it's not our style, not our aesthetic anymore.
Yeah, I think one of the things that is affected by Lindy is style, is like effectively those aesthetics over time. There's certain aesthetics, right, in terms of architecture that have retained for 1,000 years. So Lindy effect would say it's probably going to be around for the next 1,000 years. I think in terms of construction, it's particularly interesting where even in Australia and New Zealand, you've got products being manufactured in Germany and then shipped, 15, 20,000 kilometers to their final destination after all the raw materials have come from Australia or New Zealand. And so I think it's actually, I don't know, very wasteful, I think, in my mind. I think probably the best type of construction happens from local natural materials. So if you're in Australia, you're on quite a lot of igneous rock. making a stone house probably makes a lot more sense. And just because it's stone, effectively, it should last a long time. You talk about 1,000 years. I think potentially thinking about that is probably admirable, but maybe not the right time frame. I think 3 generations is probably still a nice time frame for building a house in terms of quality, because I think you can visit most cities around the world and you'll find buildings that have been around for 3 generations because they're built to a certain standard of quality that they have been able to survive that amount of time. Whereas I think a lot of the construction materials that are being used, and to the quality that they're being used, they're actually being made to be disposable after 15 years, for example. And so there's a lot of people focusing on that type of construction method and then looking at recycling to say, okay, how do we actually recycle these? But I struggle to see how sending a material from Australia to be produced and manufactured in another country across the other side of the world, and then sending the finished product back to Australia to construct, and then for it to last 15 years, I don't see that being sustainable long term.
So I can't help myself, but yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I think maybe to answer your question around what's the time frame that I should be thinking about, and thinking about cost up front, thinking about 3 generations for the construction of your house, yes, it might cost more up front, but if you think about it over 3 generations, that maybe your children or your children's generation can live in that house. Yeah, they might have to change the light fittings and repaint a few times, but effectively you've stopped the waste of the construction, the supply chain, the recycling, all of the energy inputs, the water probably as well, that have had to go on into that building potentially 10 times in that same 3 generation period.
I hope that our listeners would understand that this are only metaphors and allegories to our daily life in the office. And that they can extrapolate these things when we do also organizational design or decision making in investments or other process improvement topics. I think it's amazing. And what I wanted to say earlier, I really like the idea of the local aspect. It's wasteful, it's not sustainable to actually send something out. And I think this especially actually applies to food as well. I mean, I can arguably say that this beef is better than that beef in another country, but I think pretty much 99% of the time, if I eat local produce, it's always better, to be honest. So I think we don't need to be importing, exporting all of these things. Once you actually eat local, it's just better.
And it is difficult, I think, it applies to the organizational design sort of reality, but I think it's very difficult with the property and eating local in places, for example, like Singapore, where there isn't natural rock forests that you can actually get materials from. You do have to import. There's no place for you to pasture beef. So you do actually need to import. So there is probably exceptions to the rule, but I think generally around the world, those principles actually are usable and true.
There's one aspect, actually, I'm a little bit curious about your personal point of view. I mean, I find it already very admirable when you talk about future generations. Obviously, you're not thinking about yourself only. But how about the aspect of bringing in other people in that decision-making or that long-term thinking? Would you then have to align on that same kind of way of thinking, or is it, for example, if I want to buy a new property, I want to build it, then obviously I would include my wife, but I also would include maybe my brother, asking him, hey, what do you think? Who do you bring into that kind of decision making when there is, let's say, a general consensus of the long-term thinking? But if the devil is in the detail, for me, long is 5 generations. For him, long is 20 years. So what is your take on that?
I think when you think about your friends, your colleagues, or the people that you surround yourself with, the family that you've chosen to be family with, you've got a partner or a spouse, they have admirable qualities that you actually align with. They've got a similar mental model potentially. This long-term thinking is a very different way of doing life. And I think society as a whole has got incentives in place where long-term thinking actually isn't incentivized. Like we've got a lot of money printing happening at the moment. Every time we have a new managing director or CEO, vice president come in our organizations, there is this intention that they need to put their mark on the place. They need to make change.
Right.
So there is this incentive, I think, to think shorter term. We think in quarters, for example, in a lot of our organizations. We don't think in the long term. So how do we include people? I think generally what happens is if you've got a long-term mindset, you end up surrounding yourself, just naturally it happens, with other people that have long-term mindset. It's a magnetizing thing that people just sort of attracted to that and just sort of see. It's like a nuanced behavior is different to the way that everything else works. And so you can sort of see these people in the way that they act and the outcomes that are happening over a long period of time. Is it important, I think, to include others? Yes, it is. And I think you can actually, it's a teachable thing. Like I wasn't probably long-term thinking all my life, but in the last 10 years, it's been something that has grown and I've been able to apply more importance to long-term mindset. So it is something that is taught as you get exposure to it. And it is very much a contrarian type of thinking.
It's very, very interesting. Let's come to a close. My second last question then is, I mean, I totally agree that we would favor short-term thinking, but it's somehow we also favor hindsight. Basically, we favor the lack of time machines. So, for example, I'm just making it up. Leo Messi in school didn't remember Pythagoras, doesn't remember this. And every school teacher said, such a loser. Now he plays football, soccer, and everybody loves him. So in hindsight, he's done everything right. Always looking backwards, we have a different kind of measurement than looking forwards in terms of long-term thinking. So with that, how do you measure then the value of a long-term mindset success? When do you take the bill? I mean, obviously from time to time continuously, but how do you really measure that? Because decision-making based on a mindset and the outcomes, there's of course also luck. But how do you then actually say what is then success? What was your take on that?
I think that teacher example's interesting in that it's an exception probably to the rule. Like if a teacher says you're terrible, and then probably the more likely situation is because an authority figure in your life and you're a child and you're learning a lot about yourself and the importance of your life, I think probably the general outcome for that would be the person doesn't actually become a successful soccer player. They actually become an unsuccessful thing because they're actually against it their whole life. I do think people are able to recreate themselves out of their situations as well. And you see that a lot in very successful people across the world. In terms of long-term thinking and how do we actually value it, it's going to be different for different people, because I think it really depends on what they actually define success as, or what they see as the key driver. Like, do they see family as their key foundation? Do they see impact as their key foundation and value? They see work and their outcomes there as their key value and driver. Because I think that's the framing of your long-term mindset is what do I want to see in 3 generations' time? Maybe that's your time period. And what is how do I actually achieve or work towards that in every tiny little decision that I make through my life? It is effectively short-term pain for long-term gain. The the long-term gain is going to be different for every person, and the short-term pain is going to be different for every person. And to go probably internally into the human condition, the short-term pain might be like overcoming a vice or something like that, where you're making a decision on a daily basis to overcome a vice for a long-term gain, which is freedom from a particular vice. And so thinking about it in those sort of context is probably useful for a lot of people.
That's really, really great. And I honestly, I could talk with you for hours on that. Before I just have the last question, I just want to share with you actually, because it fits very well to the discussion we have had, one of my most favorite quotes. And again, don't take it literally, because it doesn't have to be about children and parents. It's more about the societal generational topic. But I love the saying, we have the opportunity to choose who our children's parents will be. And with that, I would like to come to a close. Any last thoughts, comments, wishes to me, towards the audience, or anything you want to share with us today?
I think there's one quote which was popularized by a US congressman in 1993, but it's effectively a quote adapted from Elton Trueblood's 1951 book, The Life We Prize. And it's, "A society grows great when old men plant trees whose shade they know they shall never sit." So it is effectively this ability to see into the future, not for your own benefit, but for society's benefit. So I think that's actually a very impactful thing, which has actually driven me towards this long-term mindset.
Well, thanks so much, Elliott. I really enjoyed this talk today. Got me really into deep thinking, and probably also hours and days to come to digest all of this. But it's great to have you on here. I really appreciate your time. Thanks a lot. Until the next time, and hopefully not in the too long distant future. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so
Bye.
much. It's a pleasure.
Bye.